Under the sands of Egypt sit giant granite boxes weighing nearly 100 tons each. In Greece, divers pulled a broken piece of bronze from an ancient shipwreck and found a machine that should not have existed in its time. And in India stands an iron pillar that has survived in the open air for more than 1,600 years without rusting the way normal iron should. These objects are real. They were found in real places. They were documented. They still exist. And all of them create the same problem. They do not fit the version of history most people were taught, because history is supposed to feel simple. First came stone, then bronze, then iron, then machines, then modern science. But every so often, the ancient world leaves behind something that breaks that order, something too precise, too advanced, too strange. Tonight, we are looking at 7 ancient discoveries scientists still cannot fully explain. We begin in Egypt, Saqqara, 19th century. Near the step pyramid of Djoser, French archaeologist Auguste Mariette noticed the head of a stone sphinx sticking out of the sand. Then another, then another. As the site was cleared, it became obvious these sphinxes were not scattered ruins. They formed a path, and that path led toward a sealed underground complex, hidden beneath the desert. When the entrance was opened, a network of tunnels appeared below the sand, and inside the largest gallery stood something that still stops people cold. 25 giant granite boxes, each one about the size of a small room, each one carved from black or pink granite, each one so heavy that the total weight of box and lid can approach 100 tons. That is where the mystery begins. The official explanation says this place, now called the Serapeum, was used to bury sacred Apis bulls. But the real problem starts when you look at the stone itself. The inner surfaces appear strikingly flat. The angles look sharply controlled. The finish seems far more exact than most people expect from the ancient world. This does not look rough. It looks measured, it looks deliberate, it looks engineered. That leaves 2 obvious questions. How were these boxes made, and how were they moved through narrow underground corridors and placed so precisely in such tight spaces? Granite is extremely hard. It is difficult to cut, difficult to shape, and even harder to finish at this level. And yet somehow, these massive containers ended up deep below ground, inside a confined passage system where moving them would still be difficult even now. That is why the Serapeum never feels fully settled as a story. Not because it proves something impossible, but because the normal explanation still feels incomplete. The site suggests that ancient builders may have understood stone weight and precision far better than most people assume. And if that is true here, what else have we been underestimating? From the tunnels of Egypt, we move now to the floor of the Mediterranean Sea, Greece, Antikythera, 1901. A group of sponge divers was working near the small island of Antikythera when a storm pushed them off course. One diver went down into the water and came back up, shaken. He thought he had found a field of dead bodies on the seafloor, but when the crew looked closer, they realized those bodies were statues. The divers had found an ancient shipwreck. Marble figures, bronze fragments, coins and broken cargo lay scattered underwater, untouched for nearly 2,000 years. At first, it looked like a normal recovery. Then someone noticed a small lump of corroded bronze. It did not look important, it looked like scrap. But a crack in its surface revealed something no one expected to find inside an ancient object, a gear. That changed everything. As researchers studied the fragments, they realized this was not decoration. It was part of a compact mechanical device made of bronze plates, dials, and interlocking gears. Over time, scans showed that the object had once been capable of tracking celestial cycles. It could model the movements of the sun and moon, predict eclipses, and follow calendar patterns with a level of precision that feels wrong for its time. The real shock was its age. This machine was more than 2,000 years old. That is why the Antikythera Mechanism still feels so strange. It does not look like a first attempt. It looks like the surviving piece of a lost tradition of engineering, and that may be the deeper mystery. Not just how one object was made, but how knowledge like this appeared and then disappeared. The next object on our list did not sink beneath the sea. It stood in the open air for centuries, and somehow it refused to decay. The next object on our list did not sink beneath the sea. It stood in the open air for centuries, and somehow it refused to decay. India, Delhi, ancient world. In the courtyard of the Qutb complex stands an iron pillar more than 7 meters tall and weighing over 6 tons. For more than 1,600 years, it has stood exposed to heat, rain, dust, and shifting weather. And yet it has never rusted the way normal iron should. That is what made it famous, because iron is not supposed to behave like this. Leave ordinary iron in the open long enough and rust takes over. Moisture gets in, the surface breaks down, corrosion spreads. That is the normal story, but not here. The iron pillar of Delhi has survived century after century with only minimal corrosion, even though it has spent all that time outdoors. Kingdoms changed around it. Empires rose and fell, armies passed through, the pillar stayed where it was. And that is what makes it feel so strange. The obvious question is simple. What did ancient metalworkers know that later generations forgot? Researchers eventually found that the pillar was not made from modern steel at all. Its composition is unusual. It contains a relatively high amount of phosphorus and very low levels of some elements that normally affect corrosion. Over time, that chemistry helped form a thin protective layer across the surface, slowing rust far more than expected. That is the scientific explanation, but even that does not make the mystery disappear. Because explaining the chemistry is one thing, actually producing a 6-ton iron pillar that survives like this is something else. This was not a tool, not a blade, not a small ceremonial object. It was a massive iron column forged in the ancient world and left standing in the open air for more than 1.5 millenniums. That is why the question never really goes away. How did smiths of that period produce something so stable, so durable, and so resistant to decay without modern metallurgy, chemical testing, or industrial control? The pillar suggests a level of practical skill that feels easy to underestimate now. Not textbook knowledge, working knowledge, heat, timing, repetition, knowing exactly how far to push the metal and when to stop. And that may be why it still feels so impressive, not because the pillar is magical, but because it shows that ancient craftsmen sometimes achieved results modern people do not expect from them. From a pillar that resisted time, we move now to an object that may have done something even stranger. It may have produced electricity. Iraq, near Baghdad, 20th century discovery. During excavations near the ruins of ancient settlements in the region, archaeologists found a small clay jar. At first glance, it looked ordinary, just another container from the ancient world. But inside it was something that changed the conversation. A copper cylinder, and inside that cylinder, an iron rod. The parts were arranged in a way that immediately caught attention because to some researchers, the design looked familiar. It looked like a battery. The object later became known as the Baghdad Battery, and from the moment people began studying it, the argument started. If the jar once held an acidic liquid, something like vinegar or grape juice, it could in theory have produced a small electric charge. That possibility was too strange to ignore. Because if that interpretation is correct, then this object points to a form of ancient electrical knowledge long before the modern age officially began. Later, reconstructions only made the mystery more famous. Replicas built in modern times showed that the design could generate a small voltage under the right conditions, not enough to power anything large, but enough to raise a much bigger question: what was it for? Some researchers suggested electroplating. Others thought it may have had a medical use, a ritual purpose, or something else entirely. And some argued the battery theory may be wrong from the beginning, that the object was never meant to produce electricity at all. That is exactly why it remains so fascinating. The debate is still open, because even now there is no single explanation everyone agrees on. And that uncertainty keeps the object alive. The Baghdad Battery sits in that uncomfortable space between artifact and possibility, between what it clearly is and what it may once have done. Maybe it really was a simple container, maybe it was something more. But if ancient craftsmen understood even the basic principle behind a device like this, then history becomes harder to keep in neat categories. Because once again, the past starts to look less primitive than expected. From iron that would not rust, to a jar that may have held electricity. The pattern is becoming harder to ignore. Some ancient discoveries do not just survive history, they disturb it. And the next one on our list does exactly that through glass, light, and a level of control no one expects from the Roman world. The next object on our list does not look powerful, it does not look complicated, it does not look like something that should still confuse people now, and yet it does. Rome, ancient world. A glass cup. Today it is known as the Lycurgus Cup. At first glance, it looks like a beautiful Roman vessel carved with a scene from myth, but the real mystery has nothing to do with the carving. It has to do with light. Seen from the front, the cup looks green, but when light passes through it from behind, it turns deep red. That is not damage, not illusion, not a trick of modern display. That is the object itself. For a long time, people could see the effect without fully understanding it. The cup was clearly rare, clearly unusual, but the real explanation turned out to be even stranger than the color change. When scientists studied similar Roman glass under powerful microscopes, they found tiny particles of gold and silver mixed into the material, too small to see with the human eye, too small to notice during ordinary use, but enough to change the way light moved through the glass. That is what created the effect. Green in reflected light, red when lit from behind. And that is where the object starts to feel wrong for its time. Because Roman craftsmen were not supposed to be working at this level of control. They were not supposed to be creating an effect that depends on particles so small they could never have seen them directly. And yet, they made it. Not as an experiment, not as an accident preserved in theory, as a finished object that still exists. That is why the Lycurgus Cup matters. It suggests that ancient craftsmen sometimes achieved extraordinary results without needing modern scientific language to describe what they were doing. They may not have known the theory, but they clearly knew the process, and that may be enough to make the object one of the strangest pieces of Roman glass ever found. From Roman glass that changes color with light, we move back to Egypt, and to an object that looks less like ancient art and more like something from a machine shop, Egypt, Saqqara. About 5,000 years ago, inside a tomb at Saqqara, archaeologists found a carved stone object now known as the Sabu Disk. It is one of those discoveries that people keep staring at because it does not look the way it should. It has a central hub, 3 curved lobes, and a shape that feels oddly modern. People have compared it to a propeller, a turbine, even part of a pump. Whether those comparisons are right or not, they all point to the same thing. The disk does not look ordinary, and that is exactly why it became famous. Because this object comes from very early Egypt, a period when the tools most people imagine are simple, limited, and far removed from anything that resembles later engineering. But the disk does not feel simple. It feels designed, and the material makes it even harder to dismiss. The Sabu Disk was carved from a fragile stone. That matters because the shape is thin, curved, and delicate. It is not the kind of object people casually imagine being cut from brittle material without cracking or breaking it in the process, and still, someone made it, cleanly enough for it to survive. That is the real problem. What exactly was it for? No explanation has fully settled the question. Some believe it had a ritual purpose. Others think it may have copied the form of an earlier object, originally made from metal. And then there are those who look at its shape and cannot shake the feeling that it resembles something functional, something technical, something built with a purpose we no longer understand. That does not prove it was part of a machine, but it does explain why people keep coming back to it. Because the Sabu Disk feels out of place. It looks like a design from a much later age. And when an object feels wrong for its time, it stays alive in the imagination. That is the pattern we keep running into. A Roman cup that controls light in a way no one expects. An Egyptian stone disk that looks like it belongs in a workshop, not a tomb. Once again, the issue is not fantasy. The issue is that the ancient world keeps leaving behind objects that look more precise, more unusual, and more skillfully made than the standard version of history prepares people for. And the last discovery on our list may be the clearest example yet, because it involves thousands of ancient weapons buried underground, and preserved so well that they seem to ignore time itself. And the last discovery on our list may be the clearest example yet, because it involves thousands of ancient weapons buried underground, and preserved so well that they seem to ignore time. China, near Xi'an. 1974, a group of farmers digging a well struck something beneath the soil. Not loose stones, not broken pottery, something far bigger. What they had uncovered was the edge of one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history, the Terracotta Army. Thousands of life-sized clay soldiers buried near the tomb of China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. Row after row of warriors stood in formation as if they were still waiting for orders. Faces differed, expressions differed, armor, posture, and rank all seemed carefully controlled. Even before the full scale became clear, the sight already felt overwhelming. But the statues were only part of the shock. What drew even more attention was the weaponry buried with them. Archaeologists uncovered huge numbers of bronze arrowheads, swords, spearheads, and other weapons scattered through the pits. Many of them looked far too well preserved. After more than 2,000 years underground, some blades still appeared sharp, clean, and strangely intact. That is what made the discovery so unsettling, because metal is supposed to age, it is supposed to corrode, it is supposed to weaken. But here, large numbers of ancient weapons survived in a condition that seemed almost unnatural. For years, one explanation became especially popular. Some believed the bronze weapons had been protected by an advanced anti-rust treatment. Something so effective it sounded far ahead of its time. It was a powerful idea, and it spread for a reason, because this looked exactly like the kind of site where an ancient secret might be hiding. But later, research made the story more complicated. The preservation appears to have come from a combination of factors. The bronze itself was made in a way that helped it endure, and the local soil played a major role as well. The ground where the weapons were buried turned out to be unusually favorable for preservation. That is the scientific explanation, but once again, the explanation does not make the result feel ordinary. Because even if the preservation can be described, the outcome still forces the same question. How did ancient craftsmen and builders create materials, systems, and conditions that performed this well? That is what keeps the Terracotta Army on lists like this, not because it breaks science, but because it shows what ancient skill looked like at full scale. This was not one strange object, not one isolated accident. It was a vast buried complex filled with soldiers, weapons, and materials prepared with a level of planning that still feels hard to absorb. And by the time we reach this point, the pattern is impossible to ignore. In Egypt, giant granite boxes hidden underground still raise questions about weight, transport, and precision. In Greece, a corroded lump of bronze turned out to be a machine that tracked the sky. In India, an iron pillar stood for centuries without surrendering to rust. Near Baghdad, a simple clay jar opened the door to the possibility of ancient electricity. In Rome, a glass cup changed colour with light in a way that still feels wrong for its time. And in Egypt again, a stone disk from the distant past looked more like a machine part than a ritual object. None of these discoveries need fantasy to be fascinating. That is what makes them so difficult to dismiss. They are real, they were documented, and they still leave behind the same uneasiness, because the real mystery is not whether the ancient world was magical. The real mystery is whether we have been underestimating it all along. Maybe progress is not a straight line. Maybe knowledge rises, disappears, and then rises again. Maybe whole methods were mastered, used, and lost so completely that when we find the results, they feel impossible. That may be the strangest thought of all. Not that ancient people knew everything, but that they may have known certain things extremely well, and we are only now beginning to notice how much of that knowledge vanished with them. That is why these discoveries still matter. Not because they give us easy answers, but because they remind us that the story of the past is still incomplete. And maybe the ancient world feels mysterious for one simple reason. Not because it was primitive, but because it was more capable than we were ever taught to believe. If this video changed the way you see the ancient world, leave a like. Tell me in the comments which discovery was hardest to explain, and subscribe to Eyes of Earth for more real mysteries buried deep in history.